Here's what nobody tells you about power. It doesn't corrupt good men. It just makes them lonelier until loneliness becomes a weapon they turn on themselves. King Lucien Draven ruled 5 kingdoms from a throne built on his father's bones, feared by every noble who ever smiled at him, trusted by no one who claimed to love him. Then one drunk servant girl stumbled into his bed at midnight and destroyed everything he thought he knew about survival. This is the story of what happens when the most dangerous alpha alive meets the only person reckless enough not to fear him. Stick around until the end because this gets brutal. Drop a like if you're watching from your city, and comment below where you're following this from because we're building something here. The eastern wing of Arkenfall Palace smelled like expensive loneliness and decade-old regret. Lucien Draven stood alone in his private chambers 3 hours before dawn, staring at his reflection in floor-length windows that overlooked a capital city he owned but could never truly belong to. The glass showed him back a man who looked 32 but felt ancient. Broad shoulders carried armor even when he wore silk. Golden eyes that once burned with ambition now just calculated threats. His jaw was granite. His hands were scarred from wars he'd stopped talking about. And his scent, thunder and cedar smoke, filled every room he entered like a warning. The court called him merciful, as if mercy were a flaw he should apologize for. The people called him the Iron Wolf because enemies disappeared the moment he smiled. But standing here, alone in rooms designed to house a king and his future queen, Lucien just felt like a man locked inside the wrong life. He lifted a crystal glass half filled with whiskey, older than most of his soldiers, and downed it without tasting anything. The burn felt appropriate. Everything in his world burned eventually. Loyalty, trust, hope. The trick was learning to stop caring when the flames arrived. Behind him, the bed stretched enormous and untouched. Silk sheets the color of winter storms. Pillows that nobody's head ever disturbed. A space built for intimacy that had never known anything warmer than political calculation. Today technically, the purity trials ended. 30 days of ritual fasting, combat demonstrations, philosophical debates, and celibacy designed to prove an alpha king could control himself before the empire handed him absolute power. 30 days of performing discipline like a trained animal while the court watched for weakness. One more sunrise and the crown became permanent. One more sunrise and Lucien would be trapped forever. The thought tasted worse than the whiskey. A knock shattered the silence. Sharp. Efficient. The kind of knock that meant someone important was about to ruin his night with politics. Lucien didn't turn from the window. "Come in." The door opened behind him, and Captain Selene Vale entered wearing the exhausted expression of a man who'd been dealing with drunk nobles for 6 consecutive hours. Theron was Lucien's oldest friend, which meant he was one of maybe 3 people alive who occasionally forgot to perform loyalty and just acted human instead. "Your Majesty." Theron's voice carried the particular tiredness that came from babysitting aristocrats. The celebration in the Great Hall is getting messy. Lord Carmine's youngest son tried to fight a statue. Lady Morgrave is demanding we arrest the moon for shining too brightly. And someone released peacocks into the throne room as a joke that stopped being funny 4 hours ago. Lucien almost smiled. Almost. "Did you arrest the moon?" "I told Lady Morgrave the moon was under your personal protection and could not be detained without a formal warrant." "That's reasonable." She threw a shoe at me. "Also reasonable." Lucien finally turned from the window. His face settled back into the expression he wore in public. Controlled, unreadable, vaguely threatening without trying. "How many casualties?" 3 minor injuries. 12 cases of acute humiliation. 1 marriage proposal between people who've hated each other for 16 years. Standard festival outcome. Good. Let them celebrate. Tomorrow they'll remember why they're supposed to fear me. Theron studied him with the particular concern of someone who'd known Lucien since before the crown turned him into a monument. "You could join them. The court expects you to make an appearance before dawn. Show them their future king isn't a ghost." Lucien walked past him toward the side table and poured another whiskey. "The court expects me to perform like a well-trained weapon. Obedient, controlled, perfectly lethal when required and perfectly silent otherwise. I've given them 30 days of that performance. Tonight I'd rather drink alone and pretend I'm still capable of making choices." "That's bleak even for you." "That's honest. There's a difference." Lucien knocked back the second drink and felt nothing. When my father ruled, people were terrified every second of every day. Cities burned, nobles vanished, blood ran through the streets like rainfall. Everyone said I'd be worse because I inherited his instincts without his conscience. You proved them wrong. No. Lucien set the glass down harder than necessary. I just learned to hide it better. The instincts are still there, the violence, the suspicion, the part of me that wants to solve problems by breaking them in half until they stop being problems. I just built a prettier cage around those instincts and called it mercy. Theron was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're not your father. How would you know?" Lucien turned on him suddenly, gold eyes flashing alpha dominance without conscious effort. "You served him for 6 months before he died. You've served me for 12 years. What makes you so certain I'm not just a better actor?" "Because your father never asked that question." The words landed like a knife between ribs. Lucien stared at his oldest friend and felt something crack open inside his chest that he'd kept sealed for years. The anger, the loneliness, the crushing weight of ruling a kingdom that loved the crown but would never love the man wearing it. He opened his mouth to respond. Then someone screamed in the hallway outside. Both men moved instantly. Lucien's hand found the short blade he kept strapped to his thigh beneath silk sleeping pants. Theron drew his sword with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd killed people in tighter spaces than this. The scream came again, closer, high-pitched and terrified, and definitely female. Lucien reached the door first and yanked it open. The hallway beyond stretched empty except for torchlight and shadows, and one very drunk, very small Omega girl who was currently attempting to run in 4 directions at once while holding her shoes in one hand and her dignity in the other. She saw Lucien and froze. Then she said, "Oh no." Her voice was surprisingly steady for someone whose entire body language screamed panic and wine-soaked regret. Lucien recognized her immediately. Kitchen staff, Selene something, Vale, maybe. One of the invisible servants who existed in the background of palace life like animated furniture. Brown hair falling out of a messy braid. Sharp eyes that looked too aware for someone who was supposed to blend into wallpaper. She was small, even for an Omega, and currently wearing a servant's dress that had seen better decades. She was also absolutely, catastrophically drunk. Theron appeared beside Lucien and assessed the situation with the rapid efficiency of someone who'd dealt with worse. "Miss Vale, you're not supposed to be in this wing. The eastern corridor is restricted during the purity trials." The girl, Selene, blinked at him like he was speaking underwater. "I got lost." "You got lost?" Theron's tone suggested he didn't believe that for a second. "In the most heavily guarded wing of the palace, past 4 checkpoints, through 2 locked doors, and somehow ended up 50 feet from the king's private chambers." Selene swayed slightly. "It's a very confusing palace. Lucien should have called the guards, should have had her arrested and questioned and processed through whatever bureaucratic nightmare the court used to handle servants who wandered into forbidden territory. Instead, he just stood there watching her try to maintain balance while obviously calculating whether she could outrun 2 trained warriors in bare feet. She couldn't, but the fact that she was considering it made him almost respect her. "Who screamed?" Lucien asked quietly. Selene's eyes snapped to his face, then away. Then back again like she couldn't decide whether looking at him directly was more dangerous than looking away. "I did. I saw a suit of armor and thought it was a person, and I may have panicked slightly." "Slightly," Theron repeated. "It was a very realistic suit of armor. It's been standing in that exact spot for 40 years. But, well, nobody told me that." Selene clutched her shoes tighter. "Look, I'm very sorry for disturbing your Majesty's evening. I'll just go back to the kitchens and pretend this never happened, and possibly throw myself into the nearest river at dawn." Lucien studied her, really studied her, not as a king looking at a servant, but as a man trying to understand what combination of desperation and wine had driven someone to end up here at this hour. Her scent hit him suddenly. Lavender and something sharper underneath. Fear, yes, but also exhaustion. The kind of bone-deep tiredness that came from years of grinding survival. "How long have you worked here?" Lucien asked. Selene blinked. 8 years, Your Majesty. 8 years. And in 8 years, how many times have you spoken directly to me?" She hesitated. "This is the first time." "The first time." Lucien took a step closer. She held her ground, which was either very brave or very stupid. So you've been invisible for 8 years, and tonight you decided to stop being invisible by accidentally screaming outside my bedroom? It wasn't a decision. It was more of a cascading series of terrible choices that started with Cook's Festival wine and ended with me having a philosophical crisis in your hallway. Despite everything, the exhaustion, the loneliness, the weight of tomorrow's coronation, Lucien felt the corner of his mouth twitch. A philosophical crisis. About belonging. Selene's voice dropped lower. About spending your entire life being told you're too much or not enough depending on who's looking at you that day. About wondering if you disappeared tomorrow whether anyone would notice or if they'd just hire a replacement and forget you existed. The words hung in the air between them like confession. Theron cleared his throat. Your Majesty, I should escort Miss Vale back to the servants' quarters before... No. Lucien cut him off without looking away from the small Omega who'd just articulated his entire existence in 3 sentences. She's drunk, exhausted, and apparently having the kind of existential crisis I'm not cruel enough to interrupt. He stepped back and gestured toward his chambers. Sleep it off. Leave at dawn. Don't make me regret basic human decency. Selene stared at him like he'd just offered her a live grenade. You want me to sleep in your room? I want you to stop screaming in my hallway and disturbing the 2 hours of peace I get before sunrise. There's a bed. Use it. I'll be in the study. But the purity trials are about discipline, not cruelty. You're drunk and lost. I'm tired and irritated. This solves both problems. He looked at Theron. Tell the guards to ignore this. If anyone asks, Miss Vale is being detained for questioning about security protocols. Theron opened his mouth, closed it. Then, you're sure about this? No, but I'm doing it anyway. Lucien turned back toward his chambers and held the door open. Miss Vale, before I change my mind and have you arrested for trespassing. Selene stood frozen for another 3 seconds. Then she walked past him into the king's bedroom, wearing the expression of someone walking into their own execution. Lucien closed the door behind her and watched as she stood in the middle of his private chambers, looking like a wild animal trying to decide which direction safety existed. The bed is there, he pointed. Extra blankets in the chest if you're cold. Water on the side table. Don't touch anything expensive and don't steal anything irreplaceable. Selene turned to face him slowly. Why are you doing this? Because if I send you back now, someone in the court will hear about it. They'll ask questions, start rumors, use it against me tomorrow when I need their support most. This way, you disappear until dawn, and nobody knows you were ever here. He walked toward the study door. Also, you reminded me that loneliness sounds different depending on who's speaking. That's worth something. He was halfway through the study door when her voice stopped him. Thank you. Lucien looked back. She was still standing in the middle of his room, small and drunk and terrified, and somehow still defiant. Don't thank me yet. If this destroys my coronation, I'm blaming you personally. Then he closed the door and left her alone in his bedroom. The study was smaller, darker, and infinitely colder. Lucien poured another drink and sat in the leather chair facing bookshelves filled with strategy manuals and philosophical texts he'd stopped reading years ago when he realized no book could teach him how to rule without losing himself in the process. Outside the windows, the capital city celebrated his upcoming coronation with fireworks and festival songs. Inside his study, Lucien Draven sat alone and wondered what it said about his life that the most honest conversation he'd had in months happened with a drunk servant girl at 3 a.m. He lifted the glass, drank, felt nothing, then closed his eyes and tried to remember what hope felt like before the crown taught him to call it weakness. 2 hours later, Lucien woke to screaming, not the panicked kind from earlier. This was different, sharper, closer. The sound of someone trapped inside a nightmare that had followed them from sleep into waking. He moved without thinking, through the study, through the connecting door, into his bedroom where early dawn light was just starting to paint everything gray and colorless. Selene was in his bed. That part didn't surprise him. What surprised him was that she'd burrowed into his pillows like someone trying to hide from the world itself. The blankets were twisted around her body. Her face was pressed into the sheets, and she was making small, broken sounds that made every protective instinct in his alpha hindbrain suddenly roar to life. Lucien approached slowly. "Miss Vale." The sound stopped. She went perfectly still. Then she lifted her head and looked at him with eyes that were red from crying and too aware for someone who should still be drunk. Their eyes met. Something shifted in the air between them. Not attraction, not yet. Something deeper and infinitely more dangerous. Recognition. The kind that happened when two people looked at each other and saw matching survival scars. Selene sat up slowly. The blankets fell away. Lucien's shirt, the one he'd left draped over the chair, was now wrapped around her shoulders like armor. She'd stolen his scent without realizing it. "I had a nightmare." Her voice was rough from sleep and wine and something older. "I'm sorry for waking you." Lucien should have stepped back. Should have maintained distance. Should have remembered that kings don't kneel beside crying Omega servants who smell like lavender and borrowed thunder. Instead, he sat on the edge of the bed and asked the question that changed everything. "Did someone hurt you before you came here?" Selene went absolutely still. The silence stretched between them like a battlefield. Then she whispered, "Why does that matter?" "Because rulers who crave domination ask who trespassed. Kings who ask if you were harmed are infinitely more dangerous. They make people willing to die for them." Lucien held her gaze. "So I'm asking again. Did someone hurt you before you came here?" Selene's hands twisted in the fabric of his shirt. "Everyone hurts everyone eventually. That's just how surviving works when you're born wrong. You're not wrong. You don't know that." "No. But I know what it looks like when someone's been carrying weight they shouldn't have to carry alone." He gestured at the room around them. "This palace is full of people who would kill for power. You stumbled in here drunk and terrified, and the first thing you did was apologize for existing. That's not weakness. That's just exhaustion wearing the wrong name." Selene stared at him like he'd just spoken a language she'd forgotten existed. Then she did something that destroyed them both. She asked, "What if I don't want to leave?" The words hit Lucien like a blade between ribs, because he understood exactly what she was really asking. What if I stayed? What if someone finally saw me? What if I stopped running? Every rational part of his brain screamed at him to end this, to send her away, to protect his coronation and his throne and his carefully constructed isolation. Instead, he heard himself say, "Then you stay until you want to go." That was the moment fate quietly sharpened its knife. Neither of them knew it yet, but the eastern wing of Arkenfall Palace would never smell like loneliness again. Selene left at dawn like they'd agreed. Lucien watched her slip through the study door wearing yesterday's dress and carrying her shoes and looking like someone who'd just survived something she didn't have words for yet. She paused at the threshold, looked back. Their eyes met one more time, then she was gone. Lucien stood alone in chambers that suddenly felt twice as empty as before and tried to convince himself that nothing important had happened. Just a drunk servant, just a moment of weakness, just basic human kindness that would be forgotten by sunset. He almost believed it. Then Theron burst through the main doors wearing the expression of someone whose worst nightmare had just knocked on the front door and demanded entry. "We have a problem." Lucien turned slowly. "Define problem." "Queen Dowager Seraphine knows." The world stopped. Lucien's voice went deadly quiet. "Knows what?" "That a servant girl spent the night in your chambers." Theron's face was pale. "She's calling an emergency council, demanding you answer questions about violating the purity trials. Half the court is already gathering in the throne room." "Who told her?" Theron shook his head. "Does it matter? She knows. The priests know. By noon, the entire capital will know. Your coronation is in 8 hours, and right now it's hanging by a thread because someone saw Miss Vale leaving your chambers at dawn." Lucien felt ice slide through his veins. Not panic, not yet. Just the cold calculation that came from years of surviving court politics and family betrayal, and enemies who smiled before they struck. Seraphine, his father's second wife, the woman who'd spent 12 years trying to position her own son for the throne. The architect behind half the corruption that had rotted the court from within. She'd been waiting for this. One mistake, one moment of human weakness, one chance to destroy him. And Lucien had handed it to her wrapped in silk sheets and early morning kindness. "Where's Miss Vale now?" Lucien's voice carried no emotion, just alpha command cold enough to freeze blood. Back in the kitchens. Theron moved closer. Your Majesty, we can contain this. Deny everything. Claim Miss Vale broke in. Make her the criminal instead of... No. Lucien cut him off with the tone that had ended wars. I won't sacrifice her to save my crown. That's what my father would have done. That's what Seraphine expects me to do. He turned toward the windows where sunrise was painting Arkenfall in shades of gold and blood, which means we do something different. What? Lucien smiled. It was not a kind smile. We buy time, and then we burn down everyone stupid enough to stand between me and what I choose to protect. The words hung in the air like a declaration of war, because that was the difference between tyrants and kings. A tyrant protects power at any cost. A king decides what is worth losing power for. And Lucien Draven had just decided that a drunk servant girl with sharp eyes and matching survival scars was worth burning his entire empire to protect. Outside the palace, bells began to ring. The emergency council was gathering. The empire was about to watch their future king make an impossible choice. And in the kitchens below, Selene Vale stood alone wondering why the most dangerous alpha alive had asked if someone hurt her instead of asking who dared trespass in his chambers. She didn't have an answer yet, but fate was already writing one in blood and silver and the kind of bond that rewrote history. The coronation was 8 hours away. The empire would never be the same. The throne room of Arkenfall Palace was built to make people feel small. Vaulted ceilings stretched 40 feet overhead. Silver stone columns rose like frozen trees. Stained glass windows filtered morning light into fractured rainbows that did nothing to warm the space. The obsidian throne sat elevated on 7 steps because some ancient architect decided rulers needed literal height advantage over everyone they judged. Lucien stood before that throne now, not sitting in it, because sitting felt like surrender. Around him, the emergency council gathered like vultures circling something dying. 30 nobles wearing their finest mourning robes and their worst intentions. Priests in ceremonial silver. Military commanders who'd served his father and now served him with the particular loyalty of men who switched sides whenever survival demanded it. And at the center of it all, Queen Dowager Selene Draven held court like she'd never stopped being royalty. She was 53 and looked 40. Blonde hair swept back in an elaborate style that probably required 3 servants to maintain. Green eyes that missed nothing and forgave less. She wore mourning black even though Lucien's father had been dead for 12 years, because grief was an excellent costume for someone plotting succession. Her son Matthias stood beside her, 28 years old. Soft where Lucien was hard. Charming where Lucien was cold. The kind of alpha who won loyalty through smiles and promises instead of competence and fear. The nobles loved him because he made power look easy and fun instead of exhausting and violent. Seraphine's voice cut through the murmuring crowd like a blade through silk. Your Majesty, thank you for joining us on such short notice. I know the coronation preparations must be demanding your attention. Lucien didn't move, didn't blink. Just let alpha dominance roll off him in waves until half the room looked away. You called an emergency council 3 hours before I'm crowned Emperor of 5 Kingdoms. This better be worth interrupting my morning. I believe it is. Seraphine smiled, the kind of smile that meant someone was about to bleed. It has come to my attention that you may have violated the terms of the purity trials. The room went silent. Not the peaceful kind of silence, the dangerous kind. The kind that happened right before battlefields exploded into violence. Lucien let the moment stretch. Let them all sit in their discomfort. Let Seraphine think she'd landed a killing blow. Then he said, Explain. A servant girl was seen leaving your private chambers at dawn. Seraphine's voice carried false concern. Given the sacred nature of the trials, any intimate contact during the 30-day period would invalidate the coronation. I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation, but the court requires clarity. You're sure? Lucien's tone could have frozen oceans. You're so sure there's a reasonable explanation that you called an emergency council and invited half the court to watch you question my integrity. That doesn't sound like concern. That sounds like an accusation dressed in expensive words. I'm simply following protocol. Protocol. Lucien descended 1 step, then another. moving like a predator, deciding whether prey was worth the effort of killing. Protocol says that if an Alpha King is accused of violating the purity trials, he has the right to face his accuser directly. So I'm asking you directly, Seraphine. Are you accusing me of breaking sacred law? The room held its breath. Seraphine's smile never wavered. I'm asking for transparency. Then let me be transparent. Lucien stopped 3 steps above her, close enough to dominate, far enough to maintain control. A servant entered the restricted wing last night. She was detained, questioned, and released at dawn after I determined she posed no threat to security or tradition. That's the entire story. Unless you have evidence suggesting something else happened, we're done here. Lord Carmine spoke up from the left side of the chamber. His voice carried the practiced neutrality of someone who'd survived 4 regime changes by never picking sides too early. Your Majesty, perhaps if we could question the servant directly. No. Lucien cut him off with the tone that had ended rebellions. You don't get to interrogate palace staff because you're uncomfortable with transparency that doesn't feed your conspiracy theories. High Priest Aldrich stepped forward, an old man whose authority came from tradition and texts written by people who'd been dead for centuries. He spoke carefully. Your Majesty, the law is clear. Any contact with Omega influence during the trials, however innocent, requires formal investigation. The Crown itself demands this. The Crown demands obedience to rules written by men who feared their own instincts. Lucien looked at each council member slowly, making eye contact, letting them see exactly how thin his patience had worn. You want an investigation? Fine. But understand what you're really asking for. You're asking me to prove my worthiness by sacrificing someone who did nothing wrong except exist in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's not justice. That's just cruelty wearing the Crown's name. My father would have killed her before sunrise and then burned the body to hide the evidence. Lucien's voice dropped to something deadly quiet. Is that the standard you want me to follow? Because I can be my father if that's what this court truly wants. I can rule through terror and bloodshed and make people disappear for looking at me wrong. I spent 12 years proving I was different, but if you force me to choose between my crown and basic human decency, I'll choose the crown and become the monster you're all afraid I already am. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Seraphine recovered first. Nobody's asking you to become your father. We're simply asking for clarity. If this servant is innocent, then an investigation proves it. If she's guilty of something more, then the law handles it appropriately. Either way, the crown is protected. And if I refuse, then you place your personal judgment above sacred tradition. Seraphine's voice hardened. And the council must consider whether a king who cannot follow the rules he expects others to obey is worthy of ruling at all. There it was, the knife she'd been sharpening since his father died, the real threat underneath all the careful words. Submit to investigation or lose the crown. Lucien understood politics the way wolves understood hunting. He'd been raised in courts where smiles meant assassination attempts and family dinners ended with poisoned wine. He knew exactly what Seraphine was doing. She was giving him a choice between 2 kinds of death: sacrifice the servant and prove he was his father's son after all, or refuse and watch the court question his authority until the coronation collapsed under the weight of doubt. Either way, she won, unless he changed the rules entirely. Lucien looked at Theron standing near the chamber entrance. Captain, bring Miss Vale here. Your Majesty. Theron started. Now. Theron hesitated for exactly 2 seconds. Then he bowed and disappeared through the side door. The council erupted into whispers. Seraphine's smile sharpened. Matthias watched with the careful attention of someone calculating whether he needed to prepare a coronation speech. Lucien descended the remaining steps and stood level with the council. Not above them, not below them, equal ground. When Theron returned, Selene walked between 2 guards like someone heading toward execution. She'd changed from the servant's dress into something slightly less wrinkled but no more formal. Her hair was pulled back in a simple braid. Her eyes were too sharp for someone who should have been terrified. She looked at Lucien once, then immediately looked away like direct eye contact might incinerate her on the spot. Lucien caught her scent. Lavender and fear and something underneath that made his alpha instincts roar to life all over again. Protection, possession, mine. He crushed those instincts down with the same brutal efficiency he crushed everything else that made him weak. Miss Vale. Lucien's voice carried no warmth, no recognition, just alpha authority cold enough to freeze bone. Tell the council why you were in the eastern wing last night. Selene stood perfectly still. Her hands were clasped in front of her. Her shoulders were back despite obvious terror. When she spoke, her voice was steady. I was lost, Your Majesty. Lost? Lord Carmine repeated. How convenient. It's a large palace. I'd been drinking. I took a wrong turn and ended up somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. And you just happened to end up outside the king's private chambers. Seraphine's tone dripped false sympathy. That's quite a coincidence. Yes, Your Majesty. Selene met Seraphine's eyes directly. It is. Almost like someone wanted me to end up there. Almost like someone gave me wine strong enough to make sure I'd be confused. Almost like this entire situation was designed to look suspicious, regardless of what actually happened. The room went dead silent. Even Lucien hadn't expected that. Selene continued before anyone could interrupt. I've worked in these kitchens for 8 years. I know which hallways lead where. I know which doors are locked. I know which wings are restricted. But last night I woke up somewhere I'd never been before wearing clothes I don't remember putting on. So either I developed sudden amnesia or someone wanted me to be a convenient weapon against the king. Are you suggesting someone drugged you? High Priest Aldrich's voice carried genuine shock. I'm suggesting this council should ask better questions. Selene's voice didn't shake. Like why a servant who's been invisible for 8 years suddenly becomes relevant the night before coronation. Like who benefited if I ended up in the wrong place at exactly the right time to destroy a king's reputation. Like whether you're all being used to legitimize someone else's power play. Seraphine's face hardened. How dare you? How dare I what? Selene cut her off with the particular fearlessness of someone who'd already decided they were dead and stopped caring about consequences. Tell the truth? Notice patterns? Refuse to be a convenient scapegoat for court politics? I'm an Omega servant, the lowest person in this room. If I was actually trying to seduce the king, I wouldn't be stupid enough to get caught. And if I was planted by someone else, then asking me questions won't give you answers. You need to ask who gave me the wine and who told me where to go. The words landed like grenades. Lucien watched his counsel process what they'd just heard, watched doubt spread across faces that had been certain 30 seconds earlier, watched Seraphine's careful conspiracy start to crack under the weight of questions she hadn't prepared for. Then he struck. Miss Vale raises interesting points. Lucien's voice carried casual authority. An investigation into her movements seems appropriate. Captain Theron, take Miss Vale into custody. Hold her in the East Tower under royal seal. Nobody questions her except me. Nobody accesses her except through my direct order. We'll conduct a formal interrogation over the next 3 days while I determine what actually happened. Theron moved immediately. Yes, Your Majesty. Selene looked at Lucien with an expression he couldn't read. Betrayal? Understanding? Trust? He couldn't tell. Didn't let himself care. The guards took her arms gently. She didn't resist. Just let herself be led toward the side entrance like someone who'd already accepted whatever came next. Right before she disappeared through the doorway, she looked back one final time. Their eyes met across 30 feet of throne room and centuries of power difference. Something passed between them that had no name yet. Then she was gone. Seraphine recovered her composure quickly. Your Majesty, while I appreciate your thoroughness, holding her under royal seal seems excessive. It's appropriate. Lucien turned on her with the full weight of 12 years ruling 5 kingdoms. You demanded investigation. I'm giving you one, but I'm controlling it. Because if this girl is innocent, I won't let this council destroy her to satisfy conspiracy theories. And if she's guilty of something, I want to know who put her up to it before we start executing servants. You suspect someone in this council? I suspect everyone until I have proof otherwise. That's what ruling taught me. Trust is performance. Loyalty is transaction. The only person I trust completely is myself. He looked around the chamber. So here's what happens next. The coronation proceeds as scheduled. Miss Vale stays in custody until I've determined the truth. And anyone who has a problem with that can challenge me directly instead of hiding behind questions about Omega servants. Nobody spoke. Nobody challenged. Because challenging Lucien Draven Directly meant violence, and violence meant watching the Iron Wolf remember why enemies called him that in the first place. Seraphine bowed. Of course, Your Majesty. We trust your judgment. Good. Then we're done here. Lucien walked past the council toward the main entrance. Theron followed 3 steps behind. The rest of the court parted like water around stone. As they left the throne room, Matthias called out, "Brother!" Lucien stopped. Didn't turn around. We're not brothers. Half-brothers. We share blood. We share a dead father and a crown he couldn't decide which son deserved. That's not family. That's just biology and politics. Lucien looked back over his shoulder. If you have something to say it directly. Matthias smiled. The easy, charming smile that made nobles love him. I just hope you know what you're doing. I always know what I'm doing. Whether I should be doing it is a different question. Then he left before anyone could respond. The walk from the throne room to his private study took 4 minutes. Lucien spent all 4 minutes calculating exactly how badly he'd just destroyed his own coronation. He'd bought time. 3 days. Maybe 4 if he stretched it. But time didn't solve the fundamental problem. Either Selene was innocent and the investigation would prove nothing except that Seraphine was right to question him. Or Selene was guilty and he'd just protected someone who'd been sent to destroy him. Either way, the court now questioned whether their future emperor could be trusted to put kingdom before personal judgment. Theron closed the study door and immediately said, "That was the most politically stupid thing I've watched you do in 12 years. I know you just handed Seraphine ammunition to question your judgment. I know. Half the council now thinks you're protecting a spy. I know." Lucien poured whiskey and drank it without tasting anything. But what was the alternative? Let them interrogate her until she broke? Let Seraphine turn an innocent girl into a conspiracy? Prove I'm exactly the monster everyone expects by sacrificing someone who did nothing except exist in the wrong place? She might have done something. No. Lucien set the glass down hard. She didn't. I know the difference between someone plotting against me and someone who got used as a weapon without knowing it. Selene Vale is terrified, exhausted, and too smart for her own survival. But she's not a spy. How do you know? Because spies don't challenge the Queen Dowager in open court. They play victim. They cry. They perform innocence until everyone believes them. Selene just declared war on the entire council and then let herself be arrested without resistance. That's not someone following orders. That's someone who'd rather burn than be used. Theron was quiet for a moment. So what now? Now I interrogate her, find out what actually happened last night, and figure out who wanted her in my chambers badly enough to drug her and point her at my bedroom. And if you can't prove it, then I'm crowned emperor with half the court believing I violated sacred law for an Omega servant. Lucien looked out the window toward the East Tower where Selene was currently being locked inside stone walls and careful surveillance. And the Empire spends the next decade questioning whether I earned this throne or just got lucky. That's not a plan. No. That's just reality dressed in expensive consequences. The study fell silent except for wind against windows and the distant sound of coronation preparations continuing below. Theron moved toward the door, then stopped. For what it's worth, I think you did the right thing. The right thing and the smart thing are rarely the same thing. Lucien didn't turn around. That's the problem with being king. You don't get to choose between right and wrong. You only get to choose which kind of damage you can live with. Theron left without another word. Lucien stood alone in his study and tried to remember the exact moment when protecting someone became more important than protecting himself. He couldn't. But somewhere between 3 in the morning and now, something had shifted. The throne had always been his prison. Now it was also his weapon. And he was about to find out whether he was willing to destroy his own coronation to protect a servant girl who smelled like lavender and spoke like someone who'd learned survival from the same brutal teachers who'd trained him. Outside the window, the sun climbed higher. 4 hours until coronation. 3 days until truth. And somewhere in the East Tower, Selene Vale sat alone wondering whether the most dangerous alpha alive had just saved her life or ended it. The answer was both. Fate didn't deal in simple choices. It only dealt in consequences that rewrote everything. The East Tower was the oldest part of Arkenfall Palace. Built 400 years ago, when kings still believed height equaled godliness and isolation equaled security. Stone walls 3 feet thick, arrow-slit windows too narrow for anything larger than light. A single entrance at ground level guarded by rotating shifts of soldiers loyal to the crown instead of individual houses. It was also where Lucien locked people he didn't trust but couldn't afford to kill. Selene sat in a chamber designed for prisoners who still deserved furniture. A bed, a chair, a small table, a waste bucket that someone emptied twice daily. The window faced north toward mountains she could see but never reach. The door was solid oak reinforced with iron bands that made escape mathematically impossible. She'd been here 6 hours. 6 hours to process what had just happened in the throne room. 6 hours to wonder whether she'd just saved herself or made everything infinitely worse. 6 hours to understand that she'd looked directly at Queen Dowager Seraphine and declared war without permission or plan. Selene pressed her forehead against the cold stone wall and tried to stop shaking. Her hands wouldn't cooperate. Neither would her breathing. Because somewhere between waking up in the king's bed and being arrested in front of the entire court, she'd stopped being invisible. And becoming visible in a place like this meant becoming a target. She'd spent 8 years perfecting invisibility, keeping her head down, following orders, blending into backgrounds until palace life moved around her like water around stone. 8 years of survival built on the fundamental understanding that Omegas who drew attention ended up hurt or dead or worse. Now she'd drawn attention from everyone: the king, the council, the Queen Dowager who clearly wanted Lucien's throne badly enough to manufacture scandals. Selene laughed. It sounded bitter, even to her own ears. She'd survived 8 years by being nobody. Now she was going to die for being noticed. The door opened without warning. Selene spun around, heart hammering. Lucien entered alone. No guards, no witnesses, just the Alpha King closing the door behind him and studying her with eyes that missed nothing. He looked different without the crown. Still dangerous, still controlled, but something about the way he moved suggested exhaustion winning the battle against authority. He gestured toward the chair. Sit. Selene sat because disobeying seemed stupid. Lucien remained standing. You're either the bravest person I've ever met or the stupidest. I haven't decided which. Selene's voice came out steadier than she expected. Can I be both? Probably. He walked to the window, looked out at mountains painted orange by late afternoon sun. You declared war on the Queen Dowager in front of 30 witnesses. Do you understand what that means? It means I'm dead regardless of what I do, so I might as well die honest. Lucien turned slowly. You're not dead. Not yet. Not ever, if I have anything to say about it. The words carried absolute certainty. But you need to tell me what actually happened last night. Not the version you performed for the council. The truth. Selene studied him, trying to understand why the most powerful alpha alive was standing in her prison cell asking instead of commanding. I told you. I got lost. You're too smart to get lost. Try again. Fine. Selene stood because sitting felt like surrender. I got drunk. Deliberately. Because yesterday was my 8th anniversary working in this palace and nobody remembered. Not Cook, not the other servants, nobody. 8 years of being invisible and useful and forgettable. So I stole wine from the festival stores and drank until I stopped caring about being nobody. That explains drunk. It doesn't explain how you ended up in my chambers. I don't know. Selene's hands clenched. That's the truth. I remember drinking. I remember walking through hallways. I remember thinking I should find somewhere to sleep it off before Cook found me. Then I woke up in your bed with no memory of getting there. Someone moved you. Someone drugged me. Probably. Maybe. I don't know. Selene pressed her hands against her temples. All I know is that yesterday I was invisible, and today I'm a weapon being used against a king I've never even spoken to before last night. Lucien watched her for a long moment. Then, why did you challenge Seraphine? Because she was using me. Selene met his eyes directly. I've spent 8 years watching nobles use servants like chess pieces, sacrificing us to score political points or embarrass rivals or manufacture drama. I decided if I'm going to be sacrificed anyway, I'd at least make her work for it. You could have played victim, cried, made them feel sorry for you. I'm tired of making people feel things just to survive. Selene's voice hardened. I'm tired of performing helplessness so alphas feel comfortable around me. I'm tired of being small and quiet and forgettable. If I'm dying as myself, not as whoever you people need me to be to feel better about destroying me." The words hung between them. Lucien studied her with an expression she couldn't read. Then he said, "You remind me of someone." "Who?" "Me. Before the crown taught me that honesty is expensive and survival means performance." Selene felt something crack open in her chest. "Is that why you're protecting me?" "No. I'm protecting you because the alternative is becoming my father." Lucien moved closer, not touching, just close enough that his scent surrounded her, thunder and cedar and something darker underneath. "Because letting innocent people die to protect my throne is exactly what he would have done. And I've spent 12 years proving I'm different. I'm not starting now. Even if it costs you the crown, especially if it costs me the crown, because a throne that requires sacrificing innocent people to maintain power isn't worth having in the first place." Selene stared at him, at this alpha who ruled 5 kingdoms and could destroy armies with a word, and was currently standing in a tower prison explaining philosophy, like it mattered more than politics. Then she asked the question that changed everything. "What if I'm not innocent?" Lucien's eyes narrowed. "Explain. What if I am a spy? What if someone did plant me here years ago and last night was exactly what it looked like? What if protecting me destroys your coronation and gives Seraphine exactly what she wants?" Selene's voice dropped. "What if I'm the weapon everyone thinks I am and you're just too decent to see it? Then we burn together." Lucien said it like simple fact. "But I don't think you're a weapon. I think you're someone who learned survival from the same brutal teachers I did. I think you've been invisible so long you forgot what it's like to be seen. And I think someone tried to use you against me because they assumed you'd be easy to manipulate. They were right. No, they weren't. Because if you were easy to manipulate, you'd be performing innocence right now, instead of asking whether you might be guilty." Lucien stepped back, putting distance between them. "Which is why I need you to trust me for 3 days." "Trust you to do what?" "Prove you're innocent. Find out who drugged you. Destroy whoever tried to use you as ammunition against my throne." His voice went cold. "And make very sure everyone understands what happens to people who think servants are expendable weapons. And if you can't prove it, then we improvise. But one way or another, you're walking out of this tower alive. That's not negotiable." Selene felt something dangerous bloom in her chest. Not love. Not yet. Something worse. Hope. The kind of hope that made people believe impossible things might be possible after all. She opened her mouth to respond. The door burst open. Theron stood in the entrance looking like someone who just watched the world catch fire. "Your Majesty, we have a problem." Lucien's voice went deadly quiet. "Another one? The Oracle of Blood just arrived at the palace gates." Seraphine summoned her. "The council is demanding she examine Miss Vale within the hour." The room temperature dropped 10 degrees. Selene whispered, "What's the Oracle of Blood?" Lucien didn't look away from Theron. "She's an ancient Omega seer whose ability to detect lies through scent makes interrogation unnecessary. Once she examines you, every lie you've ever told becomes visible. Every truth you're hiding surfaces. She'll know within 5 minutes whether you're innocent or guilty. And there's no way to fool her?" "No. The Oracle reads souls, not words." Selene felt ice slide through her veins. "So in 1 hour, everyone knows the truth." Lucien turned toward her slowly. "Not everyone. Just the Oracle. And I control who she reports to. Seraphine won't accept that. Seraphine doesn't have a choice." Lucien's voice carried absolute authority. "The Oracle answers to the crown, not the council. Whatever she discovers, I hear it first. Then I decide what happens next." He moved toward the door, then stopped, looked back. "Miss Vale. One question." Selene's heart hammered. "Yes? If the Oracle proves you're innocent, what will you do with your freedom?" The question landed like a blade between ribs, because Selene realized she didn't have an answer. 8 years of survival, 8 years of being invisible, 8 years of grinding through days without purpose beyond not dying. She'd never thought about what came after surviving. Lucien watched understanding cross her face. "That's what I thought." He moved through the door. Theron followed. Right before it closed, Lucien said, "Figure it out. Because after today, you won't be invisible anymore. You'll have to decide what kind of visible you want to be." Then they were gone. Selene stood alone in the tower chamber while sunset painted everything orange and gold through the narrow window. 1 hour until the oracle arrived. 1 hour until truth surfaced, whether she wanted it to or not. And somewhere in the spaces between fear and hope, Selene realized something terrifying. She didn't want freedom, she wanted to matter. The oracle would prove her innocent. Of that she was certain, but innocence wouldn't answer the real question burning inside her chest. What happened after surviving stopped being enough? Outside the window, storm clouds gathered beyond the mountains. Inside the tower, fate sharpened its knife one final time. And between them, an Alpha King and an Omega servant stood on opposite sides of a door neither of them could walk away from. The point of no return was coming, not with violence, not with politics, but with a truth that would either save them both or destroy everything. The coronation was 2 hours away. The oracle was 60 minutes from arrival, and destiny was done waiting for permission. The oracle of blood arrived exactly on time because fate doesn't wait for kings to be ready. She came through the main gates in a carriage black as midnight, pulled by horses that looked like they'd been carved from shadow and given permission to breathe. No fanfare, no announcement, just the sound of wheels on cobblestone and the sudden hush that fell over everyone who saw her. Lucien watched from the palace balcony as the carriage stopped in the courtyard below. He'd met the oracle once before, 7 years ago when his father's death required verification that poison wasn't involved. She'd looked ancient then. She looked older now, as if time moved differently for people who could see through lies into the raw truth underneath. The carriage door opened. The oracle emerged wearing robes the color of dried blood and silver thread. Her hair was white, braided in patterns that meant things Lucien had never bothered learning. Her face was lined with centuries of other people's secrets, but her eyes were young and sharp, and the particular kind of aware that came from seeing too much truth for too long. She looked up at the balcony, directly at Lucien, smiled. It was not a comforting smile. Theron appeared at Lucien's shoulder. The council is assembled in the throne room. Seraphine's already positioning this as your final chance to prove Miss Vale's innocence before the coronation. How generous of her. Lucien didn't look away from the oracle. To give me chances to prove something she's already decided is false. The oracle examines Miss Vale in 1 hour. Whatever she finds. I know. Lucien turned from the balcony. I've known since the moment Seraphine called for her. This was always the end game. Destroy my credibility or destroy the girl. Either way, Seraphine wins. So what's the plan? The plan is, I go down there, let the oracle do whatever it is she does, and pray that truth is enough. Lucien moved toward the door. And if it's not, then I improvise something more violent. That's not a plan. No, that's just faith dressed in expensive desperation. They descended through palace corridors that felt narrower than usual, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Servants pressed themselves against stone as Lucien passed. Nobles bowed without making eye contact. Everyone could feel it, the weight of something ending or beginning, and nobody knowing which one would arrive first. The throne room was packed. Every council member, every noble house, every military commander and court official who wanted to witness either Lucien's vindication or his destruction. They lined the walls like vultures waiting for something to die so they could pick over the remains. Seraphine stood near the throne, wearing victory like expensive perfume. Matthias stood beside her, playing the role of concerned brother with the particular skill of someone who'd been practicing it his entire life. And in the center of it all, the oracle waited. She'd positioned herself exactly between the throne and the council. Neutral ground, a space that belonged to truth instead of power. Lucien descended the steps toward her. Every eye in the room tracked his movement. Every breath held itself waiting for whatever came next. He stopped 3 feet from the oracle and met her ancient eyes directly. She spoke first. Her voice was surprisingly gentle, like wind through dead leaves. King Lucien Draven, it has been 7 years since we last stood in the same room. 7 years since you told me my father died from heart failure and not poison. Lucien's voice carried no emotion. 7 years since you saved me from executing half the court based on paranoia and grief. I did not save you. I simply told the truth. What you did with that truth was your choice. The oracle tilted her head slightly. And now truth brings us together again. Though this time the stakes are different. This time my crown depends on whether a servant girl is innocent or guilty of crimes she doesn't remember committing. Lucien gestured toward the East Tower. So tell me, Oracle, how does this work? Do you examine her here, in private? Do I get to hear the truth first, or does the entire court watch you dissect her in public? The Oracle's smile returned, sharp as broken glass. You already know the answer. The examination happens here, in front of witnesses. Because truth that hides in shadows becomes rumor. Truth that stands in light becomes law. How convenient for people who want to watch someone break. Truth does not break people, young king. Truth simply reveals what was already broken. The Oracle turned toward Seraphine. Is that not correct, Queen Dowager? You called me here to reveal truth, so let us reveal it entirely. Seraphine's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Doubt. Fear. The realization that maybe she'd summoned something she couldn't control. Bring the servant. The Oracle's voice carried authority that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with being older than everyone in the room combined. The side doors opened. Guards brought Selene in. She looked smaller than she had in the tower, more breakable, like someone who'd spent the last hour accepting that survival might not be possible this time. Her eyes found Lucien's across 30 feet of throne room. He wanted to say something, wanted to promise her that this would end without destruction, wanted to offer comfort that meant something. Instead, he just held her gaze and let her see that whatever happened next, she wouldn't face it alone. The guards positioned Selene before the Oracle. The old Omega studied the young one with the particular intensity of someone reading a language written on skin and breath and soul itself. Then she circled Selene slowly. Once, twice, 3 times. The room held its breath. The Oracle stopped directly in front of Selene and spoke. Child, look at me. Selene lifted her eyes, terrified but defiant, shaking but still standing. The Oracle reached out and placed one weathered hand against Selene's throat, right over the pulse point, where scent glands and truth lived together in the space between heartbeat and breath, closed her eyes, and went absolutely still. 30 seconds passed. 60. The silence stretched until it became physical pressure against every person in the room. Then the Oracle opened her eyes and stepped back. She turned toward Lucien and the council, spoke clearly enough that every witness heard. This girl is innocent of all charges brought against her. She did not seduce the king. She did not violate sacred law. She did not conspire against the crown. She was drugged, moved, and positioned as a weapon by someone else. The Oracle's voice hardened. But that someone is not who you think. The room erupted. Nobles shouted questions. Council members demanded clarification. Seraphine called for order with the particular desperation of someone watching their conspiracy collapse in real time. Lucien's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Silence. Everyone stopped. The Oracle continued as if she'd never been interrupted. The girl carries no deception, but she carries something else, something older. Something that has been hidden for many years. Lucien felt ice slide down his spine. What does she carry? Bloodline. The Oracle looked at Selene with something that might have been pity or respect, or both. This girl is not merely a servant. She is Cerise Valerine, last surviving heir of House Valerine, a bloodline that was declared extinct 16 years ago during the political purges. The silence that followed was absolute, because everyone in the room knew what that meant. House Valerine had been destroyed because they'd fought for Omega equality, education, rights, political representation. They'd been massacred in a single night of coordinated violence designed to prevent Omega uprisings from spreading across the continent. Every man, woman, and child bearing the Valerine name had been hunted down and executed, except one. Lucien stared at Selene, at Cerise, at this girl who'd been hiding in his palace for 8 years while everyone assumed her entire family was dead. Seraphine recovered first. That's impossible. The Valerines were eliminated. There are no survivors. There is one. The Oracle's voice carried certainty. I can taste the bloodline on her. Silver Omega magic, emotion manipulation, truth compulsion, all dormant, all buried under years of survival and fear. But there, waiting, Selene whispered, That's not possible. I'm nobody. I'm just... You are exactly who I say you are. The Oracle turned toward her. Someone hid you. changed your name, erased your identity, kept you invisible so the people who murdered your family would never know they failed. Who? Selene's voice broke. Who hid me? The oracle closed her eyes, reached deeper. Her breathing changed rhythm. When she opened her eyes again, they'd gone distant, seeing something that existed in memory instead of present moment. A woman. Dark hair. Kind eyes. She brought you here as a child, bleeding, terrified, begging the palace staff to hide you. She said your name was Selene Vale. She said your parents were dead from illness. She said nobody must know the truth. Who was she? The oracle's expression shifted. Cook. The head of the palace kitchens. She's the one who saved you. Every eye in the room turned toward the side entrance where kitchen staff stood watching. An old woman stood among them. Gray hair, weathered hands, eyes that had seen too much and kept too many secrets. Cook stepped forward slowly, like someone walking toward execution. She looked at Selene, then at Lucien, then at the floor. Yes? Her voice was barely audible. I saved her. 16 years ago, when the purges came through the city, I found her hiding in burned wreckage. Her mother had hidden her in a cellar before the soldiers arrived. I brought her here, changed her name, made her invisible. Why? Lucien's voice carried genuine confusion. Why risk everything to save one child? Because someone had to. Cook lifted her eyes. Because the Valerines were good people who fought for things that mattered. Because murdering children for their parents' beliefs is the kind of evil that destroys empires from the inside. Because I was tired of watching innocent people die for politics. The room processed this information in stunned silence. Then Seraphine laughed. It was not a kind sound. How perfect. The Queen Dowager's voice dripped poison. The king protects a servant who turns out to be the last heir of a bloodline that was destroyed for threatening the natural order. A bloodline that advocated for Omega equality and political power. A bloodline that every traditional house in this empire considers dangerous. She looked at Lucien. You didn't just violate the purity trials. You've been harboring a political weapon for 8 years without knowing it. She's not a weapon. Lucien's voice went deadly quiet. She's a survivor. She's both. Seraphine turned toward the council. Don't you see what this means? If Ceres Valerine still lives, then the purges failed. The Omega equality movement has a living symbol. Every house that participated in destroying the Valerines will demand her execution to prevent uprisings. And our king will be forced to choose between protecting her and maintaining peace across 5 kingdoms. The council erupted again. Nobles demanded Selene's immediate arrest. Military commanders calculated rebellion scenarios. Traditional houses called for execution to prevent Omega movements from resurging, and through it all, Lucien stood perfectly still, understanding exactly what Seraphine had done. She hadn't tried to destroy him with scandal. She'd tried to give him an impossible choice, protect Selene and watch the empire fracture, or sacrifice her and prove he was his father's son after all. Either way, Seraphine won. Lucien looked at Selene, at this girl who'd gone from invisible servant to last heir of a massacred bloodline in the span of 5 minutes. She looked back at him with eyes that held no hope, just acceptance, the kind that came from understanding that some battles couldn't be won no matter how hard you fought. Then he looked at the oracle. Is there more? The oracle studied him with ancient eyes. Always. Truth is never simple, but whether you want to hear it is your choice. Tell me. The oracle turned toward Seraphine. The girl was not drugged by accident. She was not moved by random chance. Someone gave her wine laced with sleeping herbs. Someone carried her to the eastern wing. Someone positioned her in the king's bed. And someone made sure she would be discovered at exactly the right moment to destroy a coronation. Who? Lucien's voice could have frozen oceans. The oracle's eyes went distant again, reaching into scent and memory and the truth that lived in spaces between words. Then she said, your brother. The world stopped. Matthias. The oracle turned toward him. You arranged this. You drugged the girl. You moved her. You told your mother where to find her, all to give Seraphine ammunition against your brother's coronation. Matthias stood frozen. His charming smile had vanished. His easy confidence had cracked. He looked at Lucien with an expression that cycled through denial, fear, and finally resignation. Then he said, "Yes." The single word detonated through the throne room. Seraphine spun toward her son. "What did you do?" "What you've been planning for 12 years." Matthias's voice carried bitter satisfaction. "I gave you the ammunition to destroy him. I created the scandal. I positioned the weapon. I made sure you'd have everything you needed to question his judgment and take the crown." "You stupid boy." Seraphine's face had gone white. This was supposed to be quiet. Careful. We were supposed to plant doubt, not create spectacle. "You were taking too long." Matthias's voice hardened. 12 years of waiting for him to make a mistake. 12 years of watching you play politics while he got stronger. I accelerated the timeline, forced the issue, made the choice impossible. He looked at Lucien. "Brother, you're too good to be king, too merciful, too willing to protect people who aren't worth protecting. Father knew it. I know it. The empire needs a ruler who understands that power requires sacrifice. I was giving you a chance to prove you understood that, by framing an innocent girl." Lucien's voice was dead calm. "By drugging her, moving her, positioning her as a weapon against me. By giving you a choice." Matthias stepped forward. "Sacrifice the servant and prove you can make hard decisions. Or protect her and prove you're too weak to rule. Either way, the empire learns what kind of king you really are." And what did the empire learn? That you're exactly as weak as Father feared. Matthias smiled. "It wasn't kind. You couldn't even sacrifice one servant to save your throne. How are you supposed to sacrifice thousands when war comes? How are you supposed to make the choices that keep kingdoms alive?" The throne room held its breath. Every noble waited to see how their future emperor would respond to betrayal from his own blood. Lucien looked at his half-brother and felt something ancient shift inside him. Not rage, not grief, just cold understanding. This was what betrayal looked like when it came from family. Not dramatic, not explosive, just calculated cruelty wrapped in justification and delivered by someone who'd smiled at him for 12 years while sharpening knives behind his back. Lucien walked toward Matthias slowly. Every step measured, every movement controlled. He stopped inches away, looked down at the half-brother who'd just destroyed any chance of reconciliation, then spoke quietly enough that only Matthias could hear. "You're right. I am too merciful to be the kind of king you think the empire needs. I'm too willing to protect people, too hesitant to sacrifice innocence, too soft." He leaned closer. "But that doesn't make me weak. It makes me dangerous in ways you'll never understand." Matthias held his ground. "Prove it." "I just did." Lucien stepped back, raised his voice so the entire court could hear. "Matthias Draven, you are hereby stripped of all titles, lands, and privileges. You are exiled from the empire effective immediately. You have 24 hours to leave Arkenfall. If you remain past dawn tomorrow, you will be executed for conspiracy against the crown." The room exploded. Seraphine screamed. Nobles shouted. Guards moved forward. Matthias just laughed. "Exile. That's your punishment? Exile instead of execution? You really are too soft." "No, I'm making you live with what you did instead of giving you the mercy of a quick death." Lucien's voice carried absolute authority. "Exile means spending the rest of your life knowing you had everything, title, family, future, and you destroyed it for a crown you'll never wear. That's not mercy. That's justice." He turned toward Seraphine. "And you, Queen Dowager, you orchestrated this. You pushed your son into conspiracy. You used the purity trials as ammunition. You've spent 12 years undermining my rule while pretending to support it." Seraphine lifted her chin. "I did what was necessary to protect the empire from a king too weak to rule it." "No. You did what was necessary to put your son on a throne he doesn't deserve." Lucien's eyes went cold. "You're stripped of all titles except Queen Dowager. You'll remain in the palace but under house arrest. No council meetings, no political involvement, no contact with anyone outside these walls. You wanted to protect the empire? Fine. Spend the rest of your life watching it prosper without you. You can't." "I can. I am. And if you challenge this, I'll have you tried for treason and let the court decide whether your conspiracy deserves exile or execution. Your choice." Seraphine's face twisted with rage and humiliation, but she said nothing, because even she understood when she'd lost. Lucien turned toward the council. Anyone else want to question whether I'm capable of making hard decisions? Silence. Good. The coronation proceeds as scheduled. Miss Vale, Miss Valerine, will be under my protection until we determine what happens next. And every house that participated in the Valerine purges 16 years ago will answer for it. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. This empire is done pretending genocide was justified politics. He looked at the oracle. Thank you for your service. You've given us truth. What we do with it is our responsibility. The oracle bowed slightly. Truth is all I offer. Wisdom is what you make from it. She paused. But know this, young king. The girl you protect carries more than bloodline. She carries possibility. The future you build will depend on whether you see her as a problem to solve or a partner in transformation. Then she turned and walked from the throne room without waiting for dismissal. Because oracles don't need permission to leave. They just speak truth and let everyone else deal with the consequences. Lucien stood alone in the center of the throne room while nobles whispered and guards removed Matthias and Seraphine under escort. He should have felt victorious. He'd exposed the conspiracy. Protected Selene. Proven he could make hard decisions when required. Instead, he just felt tired. Because this was what ruling cost. Family destroyed, trust shattered, the constant weight of knowing that every choice created enemies and every mercy looked like weakness. He turned toward where Selene stood. She was staring at him with an expression that held no gratitude, no relief, just shock and the particular kind of grief that came from learning your entire identity was a lie built on top of massacre. Their eyes met across the throne room, and Lucien realized something that changed everything. He'd saved her life, but he'd also destroyed the invisibility that had kept her alive for 16 years. Now she was visible. Now she mattered. Now she was the last heir of a bloodline that half the empire wanted dead, and he was the king who decided she was worth protecting even if it cost him everything. Outside the windows, sunset painted everything gold and red. The coronation was 90 minutes away. The empire was waiting, and between throne and door stood an alpha king and an omega heir who'd both just learned that survival meant choosing what kind of person you became when the world demanded transformation. Lucien walked towards Selene slowly, stopped in front of her, spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. I'm sorry. Selene's voice was hollow. For what? For making you visible. For exposing who you are. For destroying the life you built from survival. He met her eyes directly. You were safe when you were nobody. Now you're the most dangerous person in this empire. And I'm the reason why. Selene stared at him. Processing. Understanding. Then she said, what happens now? Now we figure out what kind of queen a last heir becomes when the king who saved her asks if she wants to burn the empire down or build it into something better. The words hung between them like an oath neither of them had agreed to yet. But fate didn't wait for agreement. It just sharpened its knife one final time and waited to see which one of them bled first. The coronation was 70 minutes away. The empire would never be the same. And in the space between survival and transformation, two people who'd started as king and servant now stood as something infinitely more dangerous. Partners. Whether they wanted to be or not, 60 minutes until coronation, and the palace moved like a living thing preparing for violence. Lucien stood in his private chambers being dressed for ceremony by servants who wouldn't meet his eyes. Ceremonial armor over silk, a cloak the color of winter storms. The crown still rested on its velvet cushion waiting to be placed on his head in front of thousands who now questioned whether he deserved to wear it at all. Theron entered without knocking. Your Majesty, we have a problem. Another one? Lucien's voice was dead calm. How refreshing. Reports from the city gates. 3 noble houses are mobilizing armed forces. Lord Carmine, Duke Blackwater, Baron Frost. All families who participated in the Valerine purges 16 years ago. They're demanding you hand over Miss Valerine before coronation, or they'll consider it an act of war against traditional order. How many soldiers? Combined? Maybe 800. All experienced. All loyal to houses that have more to lose from Omega equality than they have to gain from your continued rule. So they're willing to start a civil war over one girl. They're willing to start a civil war over what she represents. Theron moved closer. Your Majesty, if you hand her over, this ends. The coronation proceeds. The empire stays intact. You rule from a position of strength instead of compromise. And Selene dies. Yes, Lucien studied his oldest friend. If I give her to them, what does that make me? Alive. King. Pragmatic. Theron's voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd been calculating survival scenarios for hours. Sometimes the right choice is the one that keeps the most people breathing. And sometimes the right choice is the one that proves you're different from everyone who ruled before you. Lucien turned toward the window. My father would have handed her over without hesitation. Seraphine expected me to do the same. Matthias tried to force me into it. Everyone assumes I'll choose the crown over one person because that's what power is supposed to look like. But you won't. No. Because the moment I sacrifice an innocent person to maintain order is the moment I prove every fear about me is justified. Lucien's voice hardened. The Empire thinks alphas like me are monsters waiting to happen. They think we're one bad decision away from becoming our fathers. I've spent 12 years proving that's not inevitable. I'm not starting now. Even if it costs you the throne, especially if it costs me the throne, because a crown that requires murder to maintain isn't worth having. Theron was quiet for a moment, then, "The council is demanding you address them before coronation. They want assurances that protecting Miss Valérine won't destabilize 5 kingdoms. Tell them I'll address them in 30 minutes. Lucien straightened his armor. And tell them to prepare for a coronation that looks nothing like what they expected. What are you planning? Something my father would call suicide, and I'm calling evolution. That's not reassuring. Good. I'm tired of being reassuring. It's time to be terrifying instead. Understanding what makes a man truly dangerous requires understanding what he's willing to lose. Most rulers protect power because they believe power equals survival. But the most dangerous rulers are the ones who realize survival without purpose is just slow death wearing expensive clothes. Those are the kings who burn empires down because they'd rather die standing for something than live kneeling for nothing. Lucien Draven had spent 12 years learning to be the kind of king who maintained order through careful control and measured mercy. Now he was about to become something infinitely more dangerous. A king who'd decided what he stood for mattered more than whether he survived standing. The council chamber was smaller than the throne room but somehow felt more suffocating. 20 nobles arranged in a semicircle, each one representing a house that had survived centuries through careful politics and strategic betrayal. Each one now looking at their future emperor like a problem they needed to solve before he solved them first. Lucien entered alone. No guards, no crown, just the man who would either rule them or destroy them in the next hour. He didn't sit, didn't bow, just stood in the center of their judgment and let them stare. Lord Carmine spoke first. His voice carried the particular politeness of someone delivering an ultimatum. Your Majesty, we've served your house for generations, supported your rule, defended your decisions. But what you're asking us to accept goes beyond loyalty into madness. I haven't asked you to accept anything. Lucien's tone could have cut stone. I informed you of a decision I already made. There's a difference. You're protecting the last Valérine heir, a bloodline that was eliminated because it threatened the natural order of this empire. Duke Blackwater leaned forward. If she lives, every Omega in 5 kingdoms will see her as a symbol. They'll demand equality, rights, political power, everything the Valérines fought for before we stopped them, before you massacred them. Lucien let the word hang in the air. Let's be accurate about history. You didn't stop a movement. You murdered families, women, children, anyone who shared a bloodline you decided was inconvenient. We did what was necessary to prevent chaos. No. You did what was easy to maintain power. There's a difference. Lucien looked at each council member slowly. And now you're demanding I finish what you started 16 years ago. Murder one girl. Prove that Omega lives are expendable when they threaten tradition. Become exactly the kind of king you all feared I'd be. Baron Frost stood. His voice shook with barely controlled rage. That girl represents everything that could destroy this empire. If she lives, the houses who participated in the purges face retribution. Trials. Executions. Our families end because you're too sentimental to make hard choices. My father made hard choices. Cities burned. Nobles vanished. Blood ran through streets like rain. He ruled through fear and died hated by everyone, including his own sons. Lucien's voice went cold. I've spent 12 years proving I'm different, showing that alphas can rule without becoming monsters, demonstrating that power doesn't require cruelty. You're asking me to throw that away. To prove that I'm exactly what everyone feared, we're asking you to choose between one life and 5 kingdoms. You're asking me to choose what kind of king I am. Lucien stepped forward, and I'm telling you, I've already chosen. Selene Vale lives, under my protection, with my full support. If that threatens you, then maybe you deserve to be threatened. Lord Carmine's face went pale. Your Majesty, you're forcing us into opposition. 3 houses have already mobilized soldiers. If you proceed with coronation while protecting her, we'll have civil war before sunset. Then we'll have civil war. Lucien's voice carried absolute certainty. Because I'm done compromising with people who think murder is acceptable politics. I'm done pretending that tradition justifies genocide. And I'm done being the kind of king who sacrifices innocent people to maintain order. If that destroys the empire, then the empire deserves destruction. The room erupted into chaos. Nobles shouted. Council members demanded sanity. Baron Frost called for immediate action to remove Lucien from succession before he could be crowned. Through it all, Lucien stood perfectly still, waiting, watching, calculating who would stand with him and who would stand against him when violence finally arrived. Then Theron burst through the chamber doors. Your Majesty, the noble houses have breached the palace walls. The room went silent. How many? Lucien's voice betrayed no emotion. 800 soldiers. Maybe more. They're demanding you surrender Miss Vale, or they storm the cathedral and stop the coronation by force. Where is she? Still in the East Tower under guard. But we can't hold the tower if they concentrate forces. Then we don't hold the tower. Lucien turned toward the council. This is your moment. Choose. Stand with me and fight for an empire where Omega lives matter as much as alpha power. Or stand with them and prove that nothing's changed in 16 years except who wears the crown. You can't be serious. Lord Carmine stood. You're starting a civil war over one girl? No. I'm starting a civil war over whether this empire evolves or dies repeating the same brutality forever. The girl is just the catalyst. The real question is whether you're brave enough to change or cowardly enough to keep murdering people who threaten your comfort. Duke Blackwater moved toward the door. I won't be part of this madness. Then leave. Lucien didn't stop him. Anyone else want to abandon ship before we see who survives the storm? 3 more nobles followed Blackwater out. The remaining 16 stayed. Not because they agreed, but because they understood that leaving now meant choosing sides in a war they might not survive. Lucien looked at Theron. How long before they reached the cathedral? 20 minutes, maybe less if they move fast. Then we move faster. Lucien headed for the door. Get Miss Vale, bring her to the cathedral under full guard. And tell every soldier loyal to the crown that we're about to find out if 12 years of mercy made me weak or just gave me an army willing to die for something other than fear. What about the coronation? It proceeds exactly as planned. Lucien's smile was not kind. If these houses want civil war, they'll get it. But they'll get it from a crowned emperor instead of a disputed king. That's the difference between revolution and treason. He left the council chamber and descended through palace corridors that echoed with distant shouting and the metallic ring of soldiers preparing for violence. Servants fled past him, carrying whatever they could grab. Nobles barricaded themselves in private chambers. The entire palace was transforming from seat of power into battlefield. Lucien reached the main courtyard just as Selene arrived under armed escort. She looked smaller in the daylight, more vulnerable, like someone who'd spent 16 years learning to be invisible and was now trapped in visibility so bright it might burn her alive. Their eyes met across 20 feet of courtyard. Lucien walked toward her, stopped close enough to speak quietly. I need you to trust me for the next 30 minutes. Selene's voice was steady, despite obvious terror. Why? Because I'm about to be crowned emperor while an army tries to kill us both, and I need you standing beside me when it happens. That's insane. Yes, but insanity is what separates memorable rulers from forgettable ones. Lucien held her gaze. I told you before, you're not a problem to solve. You're a partner in transformation. So I'm asking, will you stand with me while I prove that to everyone watching? Selene stared at him, at this alpha who'd protected her, exposed her, forced her into visibility and was now asking her to walk into violence without promise of survival. Then she said, "What if I say no? Then I fight alone and probably die. But at least I'll die proving I meant what I said about Omega lives mattering. And if I say yes, then we fight together and probably still die. But we die building something better than what came before." The words hung between them like an oath. Understanding what makes someone truly brave requires understanding what they're willing to become when safety stops being possible. Most people choose survival over transformation because survival is guaranteed and transformation might kill you. But the bravest people are the ones who realize that surviving without purpose is just breathing until you stop. Those are the ones who walk into fire because burning alive for something matters more than living forever for nothing. Selene looked at the Alpha King who'd decided she was worth starting a civil war over, looked at the soldiers surrounding them, looked at the cathedral in the distance where coronation and violence would collide. Then she straightened her spine and said, "Let's burn the empire down." Lucien smiled. It was fierce and proud and infinitely dangerous. "That's my queen. I'm not your queen. Not yet. But give it 30 minutes. They moved toward this cathedral together. Lucien in ceremonial armor, Selene in borrowed robes that someone had found that didn't quite fit, and Alpha and Omega walking side by side through a palace preparing for war. Behind them, loyal soldiers formed ranks. Ahead of them, the cathedral rose like a mountain of stone and stained glass. And between them, fate held its breath waiting to see which side of history they'd land on when violence finally arrived. The Cathedral of Arkenfall was built to make coronations feel like divine approval wearing architecture. Vaulted ceilings stretched 80 feet overhead. Stained glass windows depicted 5 centuries of rulers receiving crowns from hands that no longer existed. 7,000 candles burned in iron chandeliers because someone centuries ago decided holy moments needed excessive fire. The main doors stood open. Inside, 2,000 witnesses waited. Nobles who'd stayed loyal, citizens who'd been granted entrance, military commanders calculating whether they'd be fighting for their king or against him in the next hour. Outside, 800 soldiers loyal to the conspiracy houses surrounded the cathedral like a noose tightening. Lucien walked through the main entrance with Selene at his side and 50 loyal guards forming a protective barrier around them. The crowd inside went silent. Every eye tracked his movement down the center aisle. Some faces showed support, others showed doubt. Most just showed fear because everyone understood they were witnessing either the birth of a new empire or the death of an old one. High Priest Aldrich stood at the altar holding the crown. He looked ancient and exhausted, and like someone who'd seen too many coronations end in bloodshed. Lucien stopped before the altar, turned toward the assembled witnesses, spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the cathedral. "You came here expecting a coronation. A ceremony where I kneel, receive a crown, and promise to rule with wisdom and strength. You expected tradition, order, the comfortable continuation of power passing from one ruler to the next." He paused. "That's not what you're getting today." The crowd shifted nervously. "Today you're witnessing something different, a choice. Not between one ruler and another, but between the empire we've been and the empire we could become." Lucien gestured towards Selene. "This is Selene Vale, last surviving heir of House Vale, a bloodline that was massacred 16 years ago because they fought for Omega equality." Murmurs rippled through the cathedral. "Some noble houses are demanding I hand her over, threatening civil war if I proceed with coronation while protecting her. They claim she represents chaos, disorder, everything that threatens the stability we've built." His voice hardened. "They're right. She does threaten stability, because our stability is built on the bodies of people we decided didn't deserve to live. Our order requires keeping certain people powerless so others can stay comfortable. Our tradition demands we repeat the same brutality every generation and call it necessary." Lucien looked at the crowd. "I'm done with that empire. If protecting one Omega life destroys centuries of tradition, then tradition deserves destruction. If guaranteeing equality destabilizes power structures, then those structures were never stable to begin with. And if choosing mercy over murder makes me weak, then I'll be the weakest king who ever lived." The cathedral was absolutely silent. But weakness is relative. My father ruled through fear and died hated. He was strong by every traditional measure. brutal, decisive, willing to sacrifice anyone for power. And he created an empire where everyone lived in terror of the man wearing the crown. Lucien descended one step toward the crowd. I spent 12 years proving I was different, showing that alphas can rule without becoming monsters, demonstrating that power doesn't require cruelty. Some of you believed me. Others waited for me to prove I was my father's son after all. Another step. Today you find out which one I am, because in a few minutes, soldiers loyal to the old order will storm this cathedral. They'll demand I surrender Ceres Valerine, and I'll refuse. Then we'll fight. People will die. Blood will stain these floors, and you'll all witness whether mercy makes me weak or just makes my enemies underestimate how far I'll go to protect it. He reached the crown, lifted it from the cushion, held it above his head so every witness could see. This crown represents 5 kingdoms, centuries of rule, the weight of millions of lives depending on whoever wears it. My father taught me that crowns give you the right to decide who lives and who dies based on what serves power. Lucien lowered the crown. He was wrong. Crowns don't give you rights. They give you responsibility. The responsibility to protect people who can't protect themselves. The responsibility to change systems that create suffering. The responsibility to be the kind of ruler who makes the empire better instead of just more comfortable for people who already have power. He placed the crown on his own head. No priest, no ceremony, no blessing from tradition. Just a man deciding he'd earned the right to rule and daring anyone to challenge him. I am Lucien Draven, Alpha King of Valor, Emperor of 5 kingdoms, and I will not sacrifice innocent people to maintain order. If that starts civil war, so be it. If that destroys the empire, we'll build something better from the ashes. And if that gets me killed, at least I'll die proving that alphas can be something other than the monsters everyone fears will become. The crowd erupted. Half the cathedral cheered. The other half stood frozen in shock. Military commanders shouted orders. Nobles calculated whether supporting him was brave or suicidal. Then the cathedral doors exploded inward. Soldiers poured through the entrance. 800 men wearing the colors of houses that had participated in the Valerine purges, led by Lord Carmine, Duke Blackwater, and Baron Frost wearing full battle armor. They stopped at the entrance, weapons drawn, eyes locked on Lucien and Selene standing before the altar. Lord Carmine's voice echoed through the cathedral. Lucien Draven, surrender the Valerine heir, step down from coronation, and we'll negotiate terms that allow you to rule without destabilizing 5 kingdoms. Lucien didn't move. No. Then you've chosen civil war. No. You chose civil war the moment you decided one Omega life was worth less than your political comfort. I'm just refusing to help you feel good about murder. Baron Frost stepped forward. You're outnumbered 800 to 50. Surrender now, or we take her by force, and your reign ends before it begins. Lucien smiled. It was the smile that had earned him the name Iron Wolf. The smile that made enemies disappear. The smile that promised violence delivered with terrifying efficiency. You think you're outnumbered because you're counting soldiers, but you're not fighting soldiers. You're fighting an idea. And ideas don't die when you kill the people carrying them. He drew his sword. The sound of steel leaving scabbard echoed through the cathedral like a bell, signaling the end of something old and the beginning of something infinitely more dangerous. So come ahead. Storm the altar. Kill me. Kill her. Burn this cathedral down. But understand what you're really doing. You're proving to everyone watching that the empire only works when certain people stay silent and powerless. You're demonstrating that tradition matters more than lives. And you're making every Omega in 5 kingdoms understand that equality will never come from mercy. It has to be taken through violence. The cathedral held its breath. Understanding what makes a moment historic requires understanding what gets decided when words stop working and violence becomes the only language left. Most battles are fought over territory or resources or power that changes hands without changing anything fundamental. But the most important battles are fought over whether human beings matter equally or whether some lives are worth more than others based on who they're born as. This was that kind of battle, not just about one girl. About what kind of empire survived the next 5 minutes. Lord Carmine raised his sword. Attack! Soldiers surged forward. Lucien's loyal guards formed a barrier around the altar, 50 against 800. Mathematics that suggested slaughter. But mathematics doesn't account for belief. And 50 soldiers fighting for something they believed in would always be more dangerous than 800 fighting for someone else's political comfort. The battle exploded across the cathedral floor. Steel rang against steel. Men shouted. Blood sprayed across stone that had witnessed centuries of coronations, but never one that looked like warfare. Lucien fought like a man who'd been trained by war and refined by survival. Every strike precise, every movement calculated. He cut through soldiers with the particular efficiency of someone who understood violence as language and was finally being allowed to speak it fluently. Behind him, Selene pressed herself against the altar, watching, terrified, unable to help except by staying alive and proving she was worth the carnage happening around her. Then something shifted. One of the conspiracy soldiers broke through the defensive line, sprinting toward Selene with sword raised, intent clear, murder the heir, end the symbol, win the war by destroying what they were fighting over. Lucien turned too late. The soldier was 3 steps away. 2 steps. Selene screamed, and silver omega magic erupted from her bloodstream like lightning made flesh. The power that had been dormant for 16 years exploded into existence with the force of something that had been caged too long and finally broke free. The soldier stopped mid-stride. Sword fell from his hand. He collapsed to his knees with eyes that had gone vacant and terrified. Every person in the cathedral felt it. Alpha, Omega, Beta. Didn't matter. The power rolling off Selene was ancient and absolute and carried the weight of a bloodline that had been feared for exactly this reason. Emotion manipulation, truth compulsion, the ability to reach into someone's mind and make them feel what she wanted them to feel. Selene stared at her hands like they belonged to someone else. Then she looked at the 800 soldiers still fighting, looked at the blood-staining cathedral floors, looked at Lucien standing with sword raised and crown crooked from violence. And she made a choice. Not violence, not death. Something infinitely more dangerous. She whispered, "Stop." The word carried power that shouldn't have been possible from someone who'd spent 16 years being invisible. But power doesn't care about possibility. It only cares about intent. Every soldier in the cathedral froze, not because they wanted to, because suddenly their muscles wouldn't obey. Their weapons hung useless. Their bodies betrayed them in favor of the small Omega standing at the altar with silver magic sparking in her eyes. Selene spoke louder. "Enough!" The word hit like physical force. Soldiers dropped weapons. Guards stopped fighting. Even Lucien felt the compulsion brush against his mind like fingers against stone, present but unable to grip, because Alpha Instinct could resist Omega magic if it wanted to badly enough. But most people didn't want to resist peace when violence was destroying everything. Selene stepped forward, down from the altar, into the space between both armies, small and terrified and more powerful than anyone in the room except possibly the king watching her with something between awe and fear. She looked at Lord Carmine, at Duke Blackwater, at Baron Frost and every noble who'd decided she was worth murdering to maintain comfortable power. Then she spoke with a voice that carried centuries of rage refined into something colder than hatred. "You killed my family, murdered them in the night while they slept, cut down children who'd never threatened anyone, burned homes, erased names, all because we believed Omega lives should matter as much as Alpha power." Her voice hardened. "You call us weak, passive, born to serve, but you massacred us because you were terrified of exactly this. The moment when we stopped accepting powerlessness and started demanding equality." Silver magic flared brighter. Here's what happens next. You leave this cathedral, you return to your houses. You spend the rest of your lives understanding that the empire just changed forever. Not because I'm merciful, not because I forgive, but because I choose to let you live so you can watch everything you tried to prevent happen anyway. She turned toward the crowd of witnesses. The Valerine bloodline survives. Omega equality becomes law, and anyone who tries to stop it will learn exactly why powerful families spent centuries keeping us powerless. Because when we're finally given a chance to speak, we say things empires can't ignore. Then she released her hold on the soldiers. 800 men sagged like puppets with cut strings, breathing hard, terrified, understanding they'd just been shown mercy by someone who had every right to demand their deaths. Lord Carmine looked at Lucien. "This isn't over." Yes, it is. Lucien's voice carried absolute authority. You lost the moment you decided one life was worth less than your political comfort. Now leave before I decide mercy was a mistake. The conspiracy soldiers retreated slowly, backing toward the cathedral entrance, watching Selene like a weapon that might explode again. Then they were gone. The cathedral fell silent except for labored breathing and the distant sound of the city outside, waiting to see whether their empire had survived the last 10 minutes. Lucien walked toward Selene, stopped in front of her. She looked up at him with eyes that held exhaustion and power and the particular kind of awareness that came from discovering you were capable of things you'd never imagined. That was terrifying. Lucien's voice held genuine respect. I know. Selene's hands still shook. I didn't know I could do that. Nobody knew. That's what made it perfect. What happens now? Now we finish the coronation. Lucien looked at High Priest Aldrich, who was still standing at the altar, looking like someone who'd witnessed history but wasn't sure whether to be proud or terrified. And then we rebuild the empire into something that doesn't require murdering people to function. He turned back toward Selene. But first, I need to ask you something. What? Will you stand beside me? Not as a servant, not as a symbol, as a partner in building whatever comes next. As someone whose power and voice matter as much as mine. As the queen this empire needs, even if it doesn't know it yet. Selene stared at him, at the alpha who'd protected her, exposed her, forced her into visibility, and was now offering her power instead of pity. Then she said, "Ask me again when we know whether we survive the next 5 minutes." Lucien smiled. That's not a no. That's not a yes. Close enough. They returned to the altar together, king and heir, alpha and omega. Two people who'd started as stranger and servant and were now standing at the center of an empire being rebuilt one impossible choice at a time. High Priest Aldrich looked at them both. His voice shook slightly. Shall we finish this? Yes. Lucien took Selene's hand. Let's show them what transformation looks like when people stop being afraid of change. The ceremony resumed, shorter now, more efficient. The words had been written centuries ago, but somehow felt different when spoken over blood-stained floors, while an Omega stood beside an Alpha and made everyone reconsider what power was supposed to look like. The crown was already on Lucien's head, but Aldrich placed a circlet of silver on Selene's. Not a full crown, not yet. Just acknowledgement that she stood there, that she mattered, that the Empire had just witnessed the beginning of something that couldn't be undone. Then Aldrich spoke the words that had ended every coronation for 5 centuries. Long live the Emperor. But this time, the crowd added something that had never been spoken before. Long live the Queen. And in that moment, between violence and peace, between old empire and new possibility, Lucien Draven and Ceres Valerine became something history had never seen before. Not conquerors, not saviors, just 2 survivors who decided transformation mattered more than survival and forced an empire to evolve at sword point while silver magic sparked in the spaces between bloodshed and hope. Outside the cathedral, the city waited. Inside, an empire had just been reborn. And between them, fate finally stopped sharpening its knife. Because the real battle hadn't been about whether they survived. It had been about what they were willing to become to make survival worth having in the first place. The coronation was finished. The war was just beginning. And somewhere in the spaces between power and partnership, 2 people who'd started the day as enemies of different worlds now stood crowned and ready to burn down anyone stupid enough to stand between them and the future they'd decided to build together. But victory is never simple, and transformation never comes without cost. As the cathedral emptied and witnesses returned to a city processing what they'd just seen, Lucien and Selene stood alone at the blood-stained altar. She looked at him. We just started a civil war. Yes. Half the empire wants me dead. Yes. And you made me a queen without asking if I wanted the responsibility. Technically, I asked. You just didn't answer. Selene almost smiled. That's not how consent works. No. But it's how transformation works. Sometimes you have to be pushed into becoming what you're capable of before you realize you were capable of it all along. That's manipulative. That's survival dressed in philosophy. They stood in silence for a moment, 2 people processing what they'd just survived and what came next. Then Selene asked the question that changed everything. What if I'm not strong enough for this? Lucien looked at her, at this small Omega who'd stopped an army with words and power that shouldn't have existed. Then said, "You just ended a battle without killing anyone. That's not weakness. That's the most dangerous kind of strength, the kind that makes people question whether violence was necessary in the first place. And if I fail, then we fail together. But at least we'll fail trying to build something better instead of succeeding at maintaining something broken." The words hung between them like a promise neither had fully agreed to yet. Outside the cathedral, storm clouds gathered. Inside, two people stood crowned and covered in other people's blood, wondering whether the empire they'd just saved was worth the cost of saving it. The answer was still being written, in violence, in transformation, in the impossible partnership between an alpha who'd decided mercy was strength and an omega who'd discovered power could sound like peace. The coronation was finished, but the real battle, the one that would determine whether their empire evolved or collapsed, was just beginning. And neither of them knew yet whether they'd survive what came next or whether they'd become the next names added to history's list of rulers who tried to change everything and ended up destroyed by the very systems they'd tried to transform. The only certainty was this: they'd made their choice. Now they had to live with the consequences, even if those consequences burned the empire down around them. 3 days after the coronation, the empire held its breath waiting for whatever came next. Lucien stood on the palace balcony overlooking Arkenfall at dawn. The city below moved differently now, slower, more cautious, like a living thing that had survived violence and wasn't sure whether the danger had passed or just paused to reload. Smoke still rose from districts where loyalist and conspiracy forces had clashed in street fighting that lasted 40 hours after the cathedral battle. Buildings bore scorch marks. Streets showed bloodstains that rain hadn't washed away yet. The empire had survived its civil war, but the scars would take decades to heal, if they healed at all. Behind him, the bedroom door opened. Selene emerged wearing robes that still looked borrowed because nothing in the palace had been designed for an Omega Queen who'd arrived through violence instead of political marriage. She joined him at the balcony railing, didn't speak, just stood there watching the same wounded city trying to remember what normal looked like. Lucien broke the silence first. 3 noble houses have formally surrendered. Lord Carmine, Duke Blackwater, Baron Frost. They're offering reparations for the Valerine massacre in exchange for avoiding execution. What did you tell them? That I'd consider their offers after they stood trial for genocide. Public trials, full testimony from survivors. Everything documented so history can't pretend it didn't happen. And if they refuse, then they get executed for treason instead of genocide. Either way, they don't get to pretend 16 years of massacre was justified politics. Selene was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're making enemies of every traditional house in the empire. I already did that the moment I refused to sacrifice you. This is just making it official." Lucien turned to face her. "How are you holding up?" Selene looked at her hands. The same hands that had stopped an army 3 days ago. "I keep expecting to wake up back in the kitchens. Invisible. Safe. Nobody trying to kill me because of a bloodline I didn't know I had. You miss being invisible. I miss being simple. When I was nobody, survival was straightforward. Keep your head down. Follow orders. Don't draw attention. Now I'm a queen standing at the center of a civil war I didn't ask for, and everyone wants me to be something I don't know how to be. What do they want you to be? A symbol. A leader. The voice of Omega equality across 5 kingdoms. They want me to stand in front of crowds and give speeches about justice and transformation like I have answers instead of just more questions. And what do you want to be?" Selene turned toward him. Her eyes held exhaustion and something harder underneath. "I want to matter. Not as a symbol. Not as a bloodline. Just as someone whose existence improved things instead of just surviving them. But I don't know if that's possible when everyone sees a crown before they see a person." The words landed between them with the weight of something deeply understood, because that was exactly how Lucien had felt for 12 years. Trapped inside visibility so bright it burned away everything except the role people needed him to play. He opened his mouth to respond. Theron appeared in the doorway. "Your Majesty, the council is assembled. They're demanding answers about what happens next. Tell them I'll address them in 1 hour." Lucien didn't look away from Selene. "And tell them to prepare for policy changes that look nothing like tradition. Theron hesitated. Your Majesty, the Council is fragile right now. Half of them nearly died 3 days ago. They're looking for stability, not more transformation. Then they're looking in the wrong place. Because stability is what got us into this mess. 12 years of maintaining comfortable order while pretending genocide was acceptable cost of tradition. I'm done with that empire. We're building something different even if it scares everyone, including me. Theron left without another word. Selene studied Lucien with an expression he couldn't quite read. You sound different. Different how? Like someone who stopped apologizing for taking up space. Maybe I did. Lucien looked back at the city. I spent 12 years trying to prove I wasn't my father, trying to demonstrate that alphas could rule without becoming monsters, trying to earn legitimacy through mercy and measured control. And it almost got you killed because I was too careful to be dangerous when danger was required. So now you're going to be your father? No. Now I'm going to be something neither of us had words for yet. Not tyrant, not savior. Just a king who understands that sometimes mercy looks like violence, and violence looks like the only honest response to systems that require suffering to function. That's bleak. That's reality. Transformation doesn't happen through polite requests and careful compromise. It happens through people who decide what they stand for matters more than whether standing for it destroys them. Understanding what makes someone truly powerful requires understanding what they're willing to sacrifice to prove principles matter more than survival. Most rulers protect their position because losing power means losing everything they've built. But the most powerful rulers are the ones who realize that power without purpose is just weight that crushes you slowly until nothing's left except the performance of authority. Those are the leaders who risk everything because they've already lost what mattered most. The belief that what they're doing makes any difference at all. Lucien Draven had spent 3 days watching his empire fracture and wondering whether protecting one Omega life had been worth the cost of civil war and countless deaths. Now standing beside that Omega, while she tried to understand what kind of queen she'd become, he realized something that changed his entire understanding of what ruling meant. It hadn't been about protecting her life. It had been about proving that all lives mattered equally enough to risk everything when systems claimed otherwise. That was the difference between maintaining order and building justice. Order required sacrifice. Justice required transformation. And transformation required being willing to burn down everything comfortable to build something better from the ashes. Boestag. The council chamber felt different now. Half the seats were empty. Nobles who'd fled during the Civil War or died defending positions they'd chosen. The remaining council members looked exhausted and wary, and like people who'd survived something that had fundamentally changed their understanding of how empires worked. Lucien entered with Selene at his side. Not behind him, not following, beside him as equal partner in whatever came next. The council stood as they entered, some genuinely respectful, others performing respect while calculating whether rebellion was still possible. Lucien gestured for everyone to sit, then remained standing because sitting felt like surrender. 3 days ago, this empire nearly destroyed itself over whether one Omega life mattered enough to risk civil war. He let the words settle. We lost soldiers, citizens, infrastructure, trade agreements, international credibility. The cost was enormous. And some of you are wondering whether protecting Miss Valérine was worth that cost. Lord Pembroke spoke carefully. His voice carried the particular neutrality of someone trying not to pick sides. Your Majesty, nobody questions your conviction, but the Empire needs stability to recover. The traditional houses need assurance that more transformation isn't coming before they've processed the current chaos. More transformation is absolutely coming. Lucien's tone allowed no argument, because the current chaos isn't a deviation from stability. It's the inevitable result of building an empire on foundations that required certain people to stay powerless for others to stay comfortable. He gestured towards Selene. The Omega Sovereignty Acts will pass within 60 days. Full citizenship rights, property ownership, educational access, political representation in every territory across 5 kingdoms. This isn't negotiable. This isn't gradual reform. This is comprehensive transformation effective immediately. The council erupted into protest. That's too fast. Impossible to implement. Will destabilize every traditional power structure, create chaos across territories that aren't prepared for that level of change. Lucien let them argue for 30 seconds. Then, enough. The room fell silent. You're right. This will destabilize traditional power structures. Good. Those structures were built on genocide and maintained through systematic oppression. If they collapse, we'll build better ones. You're right that territories aren't prepared. Tough. Preparation is a luxury slaves were never given before masters decided their labor was necessary. And you're right that this creates chaos. Excellent. Chaos means the old order is dying. That's the entire point. Lady Morgrave stood, one of the few noble women who'd survived the conspiracy purges. Your Majesty, I supported your coronation. I fought for your rule. But you're asking us to transform everything overnight. That's not leadership. That's revolution.
Yes, it is. Lucien met her eyes directly. Because leadership that maintains broken systems is just tyranny wearing a gentler mask. I'm done being gentle. I'm done compromising with people who think equality is something to grant gradually instead of guarantee immediately. And I'm done pretending that tradition justifies cruelty. So what happens to those who resist? Then they resist and we respond. Not with genocide, not with massacre, but with consistent, relentless enforcement of laws that say Omega lives matter as much as alpha power. If noble houses can't accept that, they can surrender their titles and find new careers. If territories can't implement equality, we'll replace leadership with people who can. And if the empire fractures because some regions would rather fight than evolve, then we'll fight until everyone understands that this transformation isn't optional. The council sat in stunned silence, because they'd just watched their emperor announce the end of everything familiar and the beginning of something that might destroy them all or remake them into something worth being. Selene stood. Her movement drew every eye. She spoke quietly but clearly. Her voice carried authority that came from surviving 16 years invisible and 3 days visible in ways that nearly killed her. I didn't ask to be queen. Didn't ask to carry a bloodline that makes me politically valuable. Didn't ask to represent Omega equality across an empire that spent centuries keeping us powerless. She paused. But here we are. So let me be clear about what I represent. Not patience, not gradual reform, not grateful acceptance of whatever scraps traditional power decides to grant us. I represent 16 years of hiding, centuries of oppression, generations of Omegas who died invisible because systems required our silence for others' comfort. Her voice hardened. The Omega Sovereignty Acts aren't negotiable. Neither is implementation timeline. Neither is enforcement. You either support transformation or you oppose it. There's no middle ground where you claim to support equality while arguing we should wait until it's more convenient for people currently benefiting from inequality. She looked at Lucien, then back at the council. Yeah. The king asked me to stand beside him as partner in building whatever comes next. I accepted. Not because I love him, not because I'm grateful he protected me, but because standing beside him means I get to help decide what transformation looks like instead of just watching men argue about whether my life matters. She sat down. The silence that followed was absolute, because everyone in that council chamber had just watched an Omega who'd been invisible 3 days ago announce the end of their comfortable world and dare them to challenge her. Nobody did. Understanding what makes a moment historic requires understanding when power shifts from people who claim authority to people who've decided claiming authority is less important than exercising it. Most political transformation happens gradually through careful negotiation and compromise that leaves existing structures mostly intact. But the most important transformation happens when someone stands up and says the old structures deserve destruction, regardless of who gets hurt in the demolition. That was what Lucien and Selene had just done. Not requested change, not negotiated reform, just announced transformation and made clear that resistance meant being destroyed by the very momentum they'd unleashed. The council adjourned 30 minutes later. Half the nobles left looking shell-shocked. The other half left calculating whether supporting transformation was safer than opposing it. Lucien and Selene remained in the empty chamber. She looked at him. That was terrifying. Yes, but necessary. Change doesn't happen through polite requests. It happens through people willing to be terrifying when politeness fails. What if we're wrong? What if this destroys the empire? Then we were wrong, and the empire deserved destruction. But at least we'll know we tried to build something better instead of just maintaining something broken. Selene was quiet for a long moment. Then, I think I'm starting to understand why being king made you lonely. Why?
Because nobody else has to carry the weight of knowing your choices determine whether millions live or die. Nobody else has to sacrifice personal desires for collective transformation. Nobody else has to become someone they're not sure they want to be because the role requires it. Lucien studied her. You're already thinking like a queen. I hate it. Good. The moment you start enjoying power is the moment you've become exactly what we're fighting against. They left the council chamber together, walking through palace corridors that felt different now. Less like prison, more like battlefield where every day required choosing what kind of ruler you'd become. Cat. 6 months later, the empire no longer resembled the kingdom Lucien had inherited. The Omega Sovereignty Acts had passed across all 5 territories after brutal political warfare that cost Lucien 3 more noble houses and created enemies he'd be fighting for years. Omegas gained rights to education, property ownership, and representation within noble courts. Traditional houses called it revolution. The people called it justice. History would call it inevitable, but everyone pretended it had required a king willing to burn his empire down to prove equality wasn't negotiable. Lucien stood on the same palace balcony where he'd stood 6 months ago. Selene joined him wearing robes that finally fit because they'd been designed for her instead of borrowed from expectations of what queens should look like. The city below looked different. New schools bearing the Valerine name, Omega representatives attending council meetings. Citizens who'd been invisible finally becoming visible and discovering what happened when systems stopped requiring their silence. It wasn't perfect. It would never be perfect. But it was better. And better was all transformation could promise. Not immediate perfection, but consistent improvement towards something worth building. Selene broke the silence. 3 conspiracy houses formally apologized today. Public acknowledgement of the Valerine massacre, reparations for survivors, education programs about what happened and why it can't happen again. Lucien nodded. Is it enough? No. Nothing's enough when families are murdered. But it's something. Acknowledgement. Accountability. First steps toward justice that will take generations to complete. How are you handling it? Selene looked at her hands. The same hands that had stopped an army. I dream about them sometimes. My family. People I don't remember because I was too young when they died. I dream they're watching, and I don't know if they're proud or horrified that their last heir became queen by standing beside an alpha instead of fighting against him. You think you betrayed them. I think transformation is complicated, and nobody gets to choose whether the path to justice looks like what we expected. That's wise, that's exhausted. Selene turned toward him. But I think I'm starting to understand what you meant 6 months ago. About partnership mattering more than power. About building something together instead of fighting alone. And I think I might be ready to answer the question you asked me in the cathedral. Lucien felt something shift in his chest. What question? Whether I'd stand beside you as partner in building whatever comes next. As someone whose power and voice matter as much as yours. As the queen this empire needs, even if it doesn't know it yet. You said to ask again when we knew whether we'd survive. We survived. Selene held his gaze. So I'm answering. Yes. I'll stand beside you. Not because I love you, not because I'm grateful, but because I believe the empire we're building together matters more than whether I wanted this responsibility. Lucien studied her, trying to understand what had changed in 6 months beyond laws and political structures. Trying to see whether the Omega standing beside him had transformed from survivor into partner, or whether she was just performing partnership to survive visibility. Then he realized it didn't matter, because partnership wasn't about love or gratitude or even genuine desire to stand together. Partnership was about choosing to build something bigger than individual survival and staying committed to that building, regardless of whether the foundation felt stable. He opened his mouth to respond. Selene continued before he could speak. But I need you to understand something. I'm not doing this because you saved me. I'm not the grateful Omega who falls in love with her alpha protector. I'm doing this because you proved that alphas can be something other than what everyone fears. You proved that power can serve transformation instead of just maintaining comfortable oppression. And you proved that sometimes the most dangerous thing a ruler can do is decide certain things matter more than survival. So when I stand beside you, it's not as your subject or your mate or your symbol. It's as someone who saw what you did and decided if one alpha king can choose transformation over comfort, maybe an Omega queen can do the same.
The words hung between them like an oath being rewritten in real time.
Lucien felt something crack open in his chest. The loneliness that had defined 12 years. The isolation that came from ruling without genuine connection. The weight of carrying transformation alone while everyone watched to see whether he'd fail. He'd expected love, expected gratitude, expected some fairy tale ending where the king rescued the servant and they lived happily ever after, united by romance and destiny. Instead, he got partnership, raw, honest, built on shared commitment to transformation instead of personal feelings. And somehow, that was better than anything he'd imagined, because love was easy. Love made people do things they'd regret later. Love created weakness that enemies exploited. But partnership built on shared purpose? That was something that couldn't be destroyed by betrayal or manipulation, or the inevitable moments when feelings failed and only commitment remained. I accept. Lucien's voice carried absolute certainty. Not as your protector. Not as the alpha who saved you, but as someone who needs partnership more than he needs romance, because romance doesn't rebuild empires. Selene almost smiled. That's the least romantic proposal I've ever heard. Good. Romance is what got my father killed and nearly destroyed this empire. I'd rather build something that survives than something that feels good while it's collapsing. You're terrible at this. Yes, but I'm honest. That's worth more. They stood together on the balcony watching sunset paint the city orange and gold. Two people who'd met drunk and terrified and invisible had somehow become emperor and queen, rebuilding an empire one impossible choice at a time. Understanding what makes partnership work requires understanding that love is insufficient foundation for anything that matters. Love makes people feel connected, but partnership makes them build together, even when feelings fade and exhaustion replaces passion. The strongest relationships aren't built on emotion. They're built on shared commitment to something bigger than individual desires. They're built on choosing to stand together even when standing together becomes harder than walking away. They're built on the understanding that transformation requires two people willing to carry weight alone when necessary and together when possible. Lucien and Selene would never have the romance historians wanted to write about them, but they had something infinitely more dangerous. A partnership built on mutual recognition that transformation mattered more than personal comfort, and empire building required sacrificing individual happiness for collective improvement. That was the kind of relationship that survived centuries because it wasn't dependent on feelings that could change. It was dependent on commitment that only deepened when tested by violence and doubt and the crushing weight of rebuilding broken systems. They would rule together for 34 years. They would fight, disagree, question whether partnership was worth the constant work of maintaining it, but they would never stop building. And the empire they built would carry their names not because they loved each other, but because they chose each other as partners in transformation, when everyone else wanted them to be something simpler and easier to categorize. 20 years after the coronation, Lucien stood in the same palace chamber where he'd first met Selene when she was drunk and terrified and invisible. The room looked different now. Renovated. Modernized. But some spaces carry memory regardless of how much you change the furniture. Selene entered wearing gray hair and expression lines, and 20 years of ruling an empire that had tested them both in ways they'd never imagined. She joined him at the window. Didn't speak, just stood there the way they'd learned to stand together, present, but not demanding. Connected, but not consuming. Our daughter graduates from the Diplomatic Academy tomorrow. Selene's voice carried quiet pride. First Omega to complete advanced negotiation training. She's already receiving offers from 3 kingdoms that need mediators for peace treaties. She's terrifying. Lucien said it with genuine respect. Combines your Omega magic with my Alpha stubbornness. She'll either broker world peace or start 3 new wars within a year. Probably both. Selene almost smiled. She asked me yesterday whether we ever regretted it. The transformation, the civil war, everything we sacrificed to build something different. What did you tell her? That regret is useless, but reflection is necessary. That we made choices that killed people and saved others, and created systems that still need improvement. That partnership doesn't mean agreeing with everything your partner does. It means standing together while you figure out how to do better. That's honest. That's all we have. Honesty and commitment and the understanding that transformation never ends. It just keeps requiring work until you die or give up. Lucien was quiet for a long moment. Then,
Do you still dream about them? Your family? Sometimes. Less than before. But yes. Selene turned toward him. Do you still dream about your father? Every night. Still trying to prove I'm different. Still wondering whether I succeeded or just became a different kind of monster. You're different. How do you know?
because monsters don't question whether they're monsters. They just consume everything and call it strength. You question. That makes you dangerous in ways your father never was. Dangerous how? Dangerous because you taught an empire that transformation was possible, that alphas could serve instead of dominate, that power could build instead of destroy. That's the most dangerous thing a ruler can do. Make people believe change is achievable instead of impossible. Understanding what makes a life well lived requires understanding that success isn't measured by whether you achieved everything you wanted, but by whether you built something that mattered more than personal desires. Most people spend their lives chasing comfort and security, and the illusion that safety can be guaranteed through careful choices. But the people who actually matter are the ones who risk everything to build something that outlasts their breathing. They're the ones who sacrifice personal happiness for collective improvement and die exhausted but satisfied knowing they transformed systems instead of just surviving them. Lucien Draven would die 7 years later from illness that medicine couldn't cure. He would die in the same chambers where he'd first met a drunk servant girl who'd accidentally destroyed his isolation and forced him to become something better than the lonely king trapped inside performance. Selene would outlive him by 12 years. She would continue ruling as queen regent until their daughter was old enough to inherit. She would continue fighting for Omega equality and systems transformation until breath stopped and commitment finally released her from the weight of building empires. But standing together in that chamber 20 years after coronation, they weren't thinking about death or legacy or how history would remember them. They were just two people who'd chosen each other as partners when everyone else wanted romance, who'd built an empire together one impossible choice at a time, who'd survived betrayal and violence and civil war and the crushing weight of transformation, and who'd discovered that partnership built on shared purpose was infinitely stronger than love built on feelings that changed when tested. That was the real victory. Not the transformation they'd achieved, not the laws they'd passed, not the empire they'd rebuilt. The victory was that they'd stood together when standing together became harder than anything else they'd ever done, and they'd never stopped building. Outside the window, the city moved through another ordinary day in an empire that had learned to breathe differently. Inside the chamber, an emperor and empress stood together the way they'd learned to stand, present but not demanding, connected but not consuming, building something that would outlast them both. The empire had survived, not because they were perfect rulers, but because they'd been honest partners willing to carry transformation's weight together when carrying it alone would have destroyed them both. That was all history required. Not heroes, not saviors, just two people who decided building something better mattered more than surviving something comfortable. The rest was just details written by people who'd never carried that weight themselves.